Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Daf Yomi Bahalacha Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik K. We pick up today on Kuf Yud. Actually, we're going to be learning Kuf Yud Beis Amid Beis. We pick up today on the bottom line of Kuf Yud Beis Amid Aleph. We're continuing to learn Hilchas Yom Tov. We're holding in Siman Taf Tzadik Tes, and we pick up today with Sif Hey. Says the Mechaber, Eli Shehu Daf of the Kaved. An Eli, which the Mechaber defines as a thick, heavy board. So this is what we would call a cutting board. This is a big, heavy cutting board. Uklihu, it's a keli, it's a vessel. Ela shemalachtai le'isur, but it is a type of keli that is generally used for a forbidden activity, something that's forbidden on Shabbos and Yom Tov. What is this board generally used for? Lichtai shpai harifais. Is used as a surface upon which to grind up kernels of grain. So this is a special board, and this is what the board was used for. I called it a cutting board, but only because it's similar to what we use as a cutting board. But this board was not used for cutting. This board was used for breaking up and grinding kernels of grain, and that is a meleches iser. That's a malacha that you're not allowed to do even on Yom Tov, even l'tzarech eichel nefesh. We learned earlier in Siman Taf Tzadik Daled that teichen, grinding, is aser on Yom Tov, even for eichel nefesh. So now on Yom Tov, this board is a kli shemalachtai le'iser. It's a keli which is generally used for a forbidden activity on Yom Tov. So now, says the Mechaber, if you turn to Kuf Yud Beis Amid Beis, mutter l'taltalai liktzav alav basar, you're allowed to handle and move this board on Yom Tov if you're going to use it to cut up meat. So you want to use it now as a cutting board. Now the halacha of a kli shemalachta l'isser, when you have something which is muktzah on Shabbos or Yom Tov, because it's an item which is generally used for a forbidden purpose, but you can use it for a permissible purpose on Yom Tov, and you want to use it for a permissible purpose, you're allowed to handle that item which otherwise would be muktzah. You're allowed to handle it on Shabbos or Yom Tov for that permissible purpose. I'll give you a classic example. You have a hammer. A hammer is a tool which is a kli shemalachtai le'iser. It's usually used for forbidden purposes. It's used for baina. It's used for building. It's a kli shemalachtai le'iser, and generally speaking, it's muktzah. But what if you have some walnuts that you want to eat on Yom Tov, and you don't have a nutcracker? So you want to use the hammer to break the nut. Breaking open a walnut is a permissible activity on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Therefore, you can use the hammer for that permissible activity. Or you have a screwdriver. A screwdriver is also a kli shemalachtai le'iser. But you have a bottle of wine that has a cork, and you don't have a corkscrew. So you want to take a screwdriver, and you want to screw a screw into the cork, and then use the screw to pull the cork out. So now that's a permissible activity on Yom Tov. You could handle the screwdriver, even though otherwise the screwdriver is considered muktzah, but to use it for the permissible use of putting a screw into a cork to take out a cork from a bottle of wine, it would be mutter. So too over here, this board is a kli shemalachta le'iser, but you have something, a permissible activity that you want to use it for. You want to use it to cut meat, and therefore it's mutter to use it to cut the meat. However, says the Mechaber, but after you complete the cutting of your meat, after you cut with it, now you're no longer allowed to handle it, and you can't handle it to move it, let's say, let's say the board is sitting out in the sun, and you're afraid that somehow the heat of the sun is going to warp or otherwise ruin the board. So now you want to move it into the shadow. That you're not allowed to do. You are allowed to handle the board in order to use it to cut meat on it for Yom Tov meal. That you're allowed to do. But once you finished the permissible activity, now that keli goes back to its muktzah status. Now you can't move it. However, says the Rama, shari. Even though the Mechaber says that you can't move the board from the sun to the shadow, there are other instances in which you would be permitted to move the board. For example, if you needed it l'tzarech gufay, you needed it for it itself. What does that mean? So the example that we just gave, where you wanted to use the board to cut meat, That's what's called tzarich gufay. You want to use the item for a permissible use. Then it's not muktzah. So too, if you finished cutting your meat and now you have some other permissible tzarich gufay that you want to use the board for, you're allowed to move it. Tzarich mekaimai means, let's say you were cutting the meat and you had the board on the table, and now you want to serve a meal on the table. You need the place where the board is sitting. So you're allowed to move the board because you need the place where it's sitting. You can move it away so that you free up the place where it was. Okay, says the Mishnah Berurah, back on Kuf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, all the way on the bottom, Eis Katan Yud Ches, Lichtoish Pai Harifais. This board was generally used to grind up kernels. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Aser b'Yom Tov. Grinding up kernels is Aser on Yom Tov because that's Teichen. And the malach of Teichen is Aser on Yom Tov, even if you want to do it l'sar chaychal nefesh. Ukidol kaman siman taf kuf dalid siv gimel, like we saw earlier. He says here, taf kuf dalid. Is that a mistake? 1 second. Well, I would have quoted it from Taf Tzadik Hey Sif Beis. He's giving Taf Kuf Dalid Sif Gimel. Taf Kuf Dalid Sif Gimel. Yeah, over there the Mechaber says Beferish Ein Koitchen Harifais B'Machteshes Gedola. You're not allowed to crush rifais in a big press, in a like a mortar and a pestle. So okay, over there the halacha is stated specifically by grinding up rifais. I was referring back to Taf Tzadikei, where the Mechaber says that Teichen is Asr and Yom Tov, and this is a form of Teichen. Okay, Eis Katan Yud Tes. Mutar l'taltalai, you're allowed to handle this board if you want to use it for the permissible activity of cutting meat. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Kedin kol kli shemalachta l'isser. This is the halacha that applies to any kli shemalachta l'isser, any keli that's generally used to perform a forbidden malacha on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Le'el b'simin shin chesiv gimel shemutar l'taltalai l'tzarich gufay. Such a keli, you're allowed to handle it for what we call tzarich gufay, if you need the item itself. And the Chavetz Chaim defines now what that means. Tahainu, what does that mean, tzarich gufay? Lasais by malacha hamuteres. If you want to use the otherwise muktzah item in order to perform a permissible activity on Shabbos or Yom Tov, that's called a tzarich gufay. And a klisha malachta le'isser is mutter for a tzarich gufay. Oil tzarich b'kaimai. Or if you need to move the otherwise muktzah item because you need to clear it away from the place where it is, you need that place. You have a circular saw, which is a klisha malachta le'isser, and it's sitting on a bed, and somebody needs to go to sleep on the bed. So tzarich mekaima, you need the place. So you could pick up the circular saw and move it out of the way, even though it's muktzah. Vedas Magen Avram, the opinion of the Magen Avram is that Eli muktzah machmas b'chisaron kis. Let's say this Eli, this board, was a very expensive board, and you generally would not use it for any other kind of use. It's a board that's specifically used for the crushing of the grains, for the crushing of the rifais, and you generally wouldn't use it to cut meat. Maybe you don't want to get cuts and scratches in the surface of this eli. So that l'chayra would be another reason to say that it should remain muktzah and you should not be allowed to use it to cut meat on it. Because not only is it a klisha malachta le'isser, but it's also muktzah machmas chisaron kis. It's muktzah because you value the board and you don't want any damage to come to it. So it's further muktzah. It's set aside. You wouldn't use it generally for cutting meat. So could we still be matir it to use it for cutting meat? It says the Chavetz Chaim, Kigoin, for example, shemakbid ala eli melehistamish by b'davar acher. You're usually makbid. You're usually very careful. You wouldn't use this eli for any other use. Shalo yiskalkel. You don't want it to get scratched. You don't want it to get cut up from cutting meat. Usually then we would say that this item is not even mutter for a different use. It's very nice that we say that normally a klisha malachta le'isser is mutter for a permissible usage, but not if it's something that you're makpid not to use for that kind of usage, because it's muktzah machach and kiss. Hacha, over here in the context of Hilchas Yom Tov, Shari, it's still mutter, Mishum Simchas Yom Tov. They're matter it because of Simchas Yom Tov. We want to make sure that you have a cutting board and you can cut up your prime rib and get nice slices. So therefore, even though there's two reasons to aser it, one, it's a klisha malachta l'isser, but okay, even though it's a klisha malachta l'isser, normally it would be mutter l'tzarich gufay, but it's also muktzah machmas chisaron kiss, so it's something that you usually makbid, you wouldn't use it as a cutting board. Over here, we're matter you to use it even as a cutting board. Why? Because of Simchas Yom Tov. Now, the Chavetz Chaim says, "Va'ayin bir halacha." He sends you to the bir halacha on Kuf Yud Beis Amud Aleph, Dibra Maschel Elo Shemalachta LeIsser. And in that paragraph of the bir halacha, the Chavetz Chaim writes that he's not so comfortable with this Magen Avram. He discusses this Magen Avram, and he says it could be that we wouldn't be matir it so quick. So, Ayin Sham, if you want to take a look. Ayis Katan Chaf, the Mechaber said, once you finish using this board as a cutting board, now you're not allowed to handle it again. Now that you finished your tzarich gufay, you finished using the klisha malachta l'isser for the permissible activity that you needed it for. Now it returns back to its muktzah status, and now you're not allowed to be metaltalit to move it mechama l'tzeil. If you have to move it, let's say, from the sun to the shadow. Or, for example, kadei shalo yiganev. Or maybe you want to move it because you want to take it away from where it is. It's in an exposed area, and you're afraid somebody might steal it. So you want to move it. You're not allowed to move it. Now, by the way, that's not called Tzairich Mekaimai. We said, let's say you had the cutting board on the dining room table, and now you need to clear it off the dining room table because you need the space on the table. You want to serve the meal by the table. That's called Tzairich Mekaimai. I need the place where the cutting board is. And therefore, even though the cutting board is a klisha malachta l'isser, I'm allowed to move it. Over here, you want to move the cutting board not because you need the place where the cutting board is. It's because you want to relocate the cutting board. You want the cutting board to be somewhere else because where it is, you're afraid it's going to get stolen. That's not called Tzarich Mekaimai. You don't need the place where the cutting board is. You just want to relocate the cutting board. That's not mutter. Says the Chavetz Chaim in the Ois Katan Chaf Aleph. So the Mechaber said, you're allowed to use this board that's a klisha malachta l'isser. You're allowed to use it as a cutting board. When you finish using it as a cutting board, it becomes muktzah again, and you're not allowed to handle it in order to move it, let's say, from the sun to the shadow. But the Ramah said, Aval tzarich gufay u'mekaimai shari. But if you need it for a different tzarich gufay, or you need it tzarich mekaimai, then you are allowed to move it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, kedin kol klisha malachta l'isser. That's the halacha that always applies to any klisha malachta l'isser on Shabbos or Yom Tov, that you're allowed to move them l'tzarich gufay or l'tzarich mekaimai. V'sadon. Now, a sadon is usually translated as an anvil. So it's a metal keli that's used as a surface for cutting something or for banging something on. So v'sadon ha'ov, a heavy, thick anvil, shekaitzvin alav basar, that you usually use for cutting meat. You're allowed to move it when you finish cutting on it. You're allowed to move it for any purpose, even if you want to move it out of the sun into the shadow, which we said is not mutter by the Eli. It's not mutter by the klisha malachta l'isser. Over here by the sadon, it is mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why? Tahahu klisha malachta leheter. That is a regular cutting board. That's a klisha malachta leheter. That's a keli which is made for cutting meat on. Cutting meat is a permissible activity and Shabbos and Yom Tov. So this isn't the klisha malachta l'isser. It's not a keli whose general purpose is for forbidden activity. This is a keli whose general purpose is for the performance of mutter, of permissible activity. So this is a klisha malachta leheter. You can use it for any reason you want, and that concludes the complicated siman of Taf Tzadik Tes. And now we turn to siman Taf Kuf, the 500th siman in Orach Chaim. Says the Mechaber, Hanitzrach lebasar b'yom tov. If somebody needs meat on Yom Tov and he doesn't have meat, so he wants to, so to speak, purchase meat. He needs to acquire meat. Now you're not allowed to buy. You're not allowed to buy meat on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to do mekach memkar on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to do business on Yom Tov. So how's he going to get meat? Hanitzrach lebasar b'Yom Tov. Somebody who needs meat on Yom Tov. Hayach yisnaheg. What should he do? How should he comport himself? And also in this Siman, we're going to discuss another topic, how exactly you should salt meat on Yom Tov. We know that basar, meat, before you eat it, you need malicha. You have to salt it to dry out the dam. And over here, we are going to have 6 seifim. Says the Mechaber. Ein kainim basar. You are not allowed to acquire or purchase meat bepisuk damim, by spelling out and specifying an amount of money, loimar latabach, so that you say to the butcher, tain li besela oy b'shtayim, give me 1 sela or 2 sela worth of meat. So, for example, you can't go into the butcher on Yom Tov and tell the butcher, listen, I need about $50 worth of brisket. You can't do that. And similarly, you cannot say to the butcher, Hareini shutaf imcha besela. You see that nice, beautiful cut of prime rib over there? I want to become a partner with you in that piece of prime rib for $25. So that's really another way of saying that $25 of that prime rib should belong to me. Now, why should it belong to you? I guess you're going to pay for it, right? But you didn't mention that you're going to pay for it. You said, I'm going to be a shutuf with you. I'm becoming a partner with you. But you mentioned a dollar amount. You cannot say, I'm entering into a partnership with you in that piece of meat for X amount of dollars. That you can't do. Ella. Rather, what could you do? So, and I'm going to explain this the way the Chavetz Chaim does between the Mishnah Berurah and the Bir Halacha. Ella, says the Mechaber, if a group of people come to the butcher and they all want meat, mechalek lahem, you can apportion out to them meat, shlishiyos, by thirds of the animal, revi'iyos, or quarters, kefi achalakim shederech lechalik ba'ir, in the usual way that the meat is apportioned out. We know nowadays there's a general way that the meat is cut up into cuts. There are primal cuts, then there are smaller cuts. So a primal cut might be a whole rib. But then you have the retail cut is a rib steak. So if the butcher wants to give out rib steaks, he can give out rib steaks. Below pisuk damim, without mentioning dollar values. It's not, I'm giving you a $20 steak. I'm giving you a typical steak. Now, how are you going to figure out how much money he owes? Umevi shtei behemos. And what you do is, and the Bir Halacha explains that the Mechaber over here is talking about a case where the butcher is doling out an entire animal. So let's say the butcher has over here a full animal, and he's going to butcher it up. And he's going to give this guy the rib, and he's going to give this guy the chuck, and he's going to give this guy the brisket, he's going to give this guy the shoulder, and he's going to give this guy the flank. So he's apportioning out the entire animal. Now, how are you going to know how much money the customers owe the butcher after Yom Tov? So to address that, the Mechaber gives an Eitzah Tova. He tells the butcher what to do. He says, Umevi shtei behemos. On Yom Tov, when you're making the deal, the butcher could bring out 2 carcasses. He could bring out 2 animals. The Yomar, and he'll say, look, zu kazu. These 2 animals seem to be very similar. Ulamachar, now, on Yom Tov, you'll take one of the animals and you'll apportion it out. Ulamachar, and tomorrow after Yom Tov, shamin hanisheres, you'll evaluate the value of the remaining animal. So, on Yom Tov, you said, look, you see these 2 animals are approximately the same? Everybody looks, they say, yeah. Okay, fine. Take one animal, put it away. Now you take this animal that you're going to apportion out, and you say, Ruvain, you get the brisket. Shimon, you get the rib. Levi, you get the chuck. Yehuda, you get the flank, so on and so forth. Well, a makar the next day, shaman anisheres, you take the leftover animal that you didn't give out, ukefish shave, and according to the value of the leftover animal, kach yipar aloi, that's how the people will pay him. So tomorrow after Yom Tov, you take the remaining animal and you take the brisket and you say, Pliny, you got the brisket yesterday? Remember we said these two animals were approximately the same? Well, this brisket is a 12-pound brisket. So figure that must have been a 12-pound brisket. So you owe me for a 12-pound brisket. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ice Cotton Aleph. Ein kainem basar, you cannot acquire meat. And the Mechaber said, you can't do this bepisuk damim. You can't mention values. You can't say, give me $25 worth of prime rib. Says the Chavetz Chaim, this of course is speaking, afilu likach b'hakafa. Nobody's paying. Of course, nobody's actually making a transaction over here. Nobody's paying. The point of the Mechaber is that on Yom Tov, you can't do this, even if it's being done on credit. Of course, I'm not paying the $25 on Yom Tov. But what we're saying is, I want $25 of prime rib now. Give it to me on credit, and I'll pay you tomorrow. Even that's usher. Why is it usher? Mishum gzeras mekachu memkar. Because the Chachamim made a gzera that you're not allowed to do anything that looks like a business transaction on Yom Tov. The Rishonim talk about various reasons why this is true. One reason is because we're afraid you're going to come to writing. Once you start doing business transactions, oh, let me write it down. How many pounds of brisket was it? How much do you owe me? What price did we agree upon? There's other reasons as well. Some say it's an Issa D'Rabbanan of what the pasuk says, V'daber davar. You're not allowed to speak business transactions. That's not covered Yom Tov. Others say that it's Mamash and Issa D'Araisa. Ice cut and bays. The Mechaber said, you're also, not only are you not allowed to say, give me $25 worth of brisket, you also can't say, look, you see that whole brisket over there? I want to become a partner with you, Mr. Butcher. I want to become a partner with you in that brisket. So I'll become a partner. $25 of that brisket is mine. You can't do that. Even though the difference between this case and the first case is, in the first case, what you told the butcher is, I want to acquire $25 worth of brisket. So that really sounds like a business transaction. It's, I'm going to give you $25, you're going to give me brisket. And I'm mentioning the dollar value, and it's very clear that we're making a transaction over here. The second case is, I don't say I'm buying, we're not talking about buying and selling. I'm stating a fact. I'm a partner with you in that brisket. So that's less, it sounds less like a transaction. Still, the Mishnah Berurah says, even though there's no speaking out over here of anybody buying anything from anybody, he's becoming a partner with him. Beguf habehema, in part of the animal, nevertheless, this is also because you're mentioning a dollar amount, and it sounds and looks like a business transaction. Ice cut and gimel. Ella, what could you do? So the Mechaber said mechalik. The butcher could divide up the animal in the traditional cuts, in the traditional portions. So the Mishnah Berurah says, ayin biur halacha. If you want to understand what this means, take a look at the biur halacha. So I direct your attention to the biur halacha. Dibur amaskilu mevi shtei behemos. Says the Chavetz Chaim here in the biur halacha. What is this that the Mechaber is saying to the butcher that he should bring two animals? Ayin Mishnah Berurah sif cut and hay, where the Chavetz Chaim is going to explain this a little bit more. Umikam makay, nevertheless, says the biur halacha, ain't I moving? This is not so clear to me what the Mechaber says. The way the Mechaber wrote this, it sounds like, what's the Mechaber saying? You can't go to the butcher and say, I want to buy $25 of prime rib. That's awesome. So what should the butcher do? If somebody comes in and says, I want to buy $25 worth of prime rib, the butcher should bring out two animals. And they should start working out the value of two animals. Says the Chavetz Chaim, if somebody wants to come buy from the butcher one seller worth of meat, the butcher has to go into the back and bring out a whole other animal. Gam ain't a minig kain. And certainly this is not the minig. This is not what people do. Ella, rather, says the Chavetz Chaim, ha'emes, the truth is, what the Mechaber is saying over here is, Mayri b'chabura, the Mechaber is addressing a case where there's a group. Sharoitzim likach besara behema kula min atabach. They want to buy an entire animal for the butcher. Zeb sela, one guy is going to buy 1 sela worth of meat. V'zeb shtayim, another guy is going to buy 2 sela worth of meat. Another guy is going to buy 50 sela worth of meat. But there's 10 people here, and between the 10 of them, they want to buy up an entire animal. The Kamash Malon, and what the Mechaber is teaching me is, Dasurim lahaskir shem damim. They're not allowed to say, we're dividing up the animal. I'm taking $100 worth. You're taking $10 worth. He's taking $50 worth. Ella, rather, what the butcher should do is, yechalkuha kifia chalokim shederach lachaloik ba'ir. The animal should be divided up according to the traditional cuts. In the traditional way, the animal is divided up in that city. And each person from the Chabura that wants to buy up the animal will take a chelik. They'll take a portion or 2 portions or a half a portion. Now, how are you going to figure out what everybody has to pay the butcher? So you have to know what the value of the animal was. In order to evaluate the meat that was just divvied up, the butcher should bring out another animal that seems similar to this animal that they're dividing up. And then tomorrow after Yom Tov, they'll evaluate the surviving animal. And according to that value, that's what the customers will pay. So like I explained, you'll take 2 animals and you say, look, these seem to be the same. Okay, fine. So now divide up animal A. And tomorrow you'll come back and we'll take out animal B and we'll say, okay, you bought the brisket of animal A yesterday. Let's take the brisket from animal B, and this brisket is worth how much? It's worth $50. Fine, you owe me $50. So that's the way you'll evaluate it. And this is just an Eitz Tova Kamash Malon. This is just, the Mechaber is not telling you here so much Hilchas Yom Tov. He's giving you an Eitzah to the butcher. How are you going to evaluate what the customers owe you? This is how you should do it. Ice cut and dalit. The Mechaber said, "Ela mechalik lahem." You should apportion out the meat to them. Dafka, says the Mishnah Berurah, you can only do this, apportioning out the meat to the consumers, beloy goyrel. You have to do this without drawing lots. What does that mean? You're going to apportion out the animal now. Now, there's 10 people here that are all clamoring for portions in the animal, and maybe some of them want the same portion. Maybe, there's only 2 ribs. Maybe 3 of them want ribs. So you might be tempted to use a girl. We'll use a girl. Who wants ribs? Everybody put their thing in a hat, and we'll pick out a girl. Says the Chavetz Chaim, on Yom Tov, you have to do this dafka below girl. You can't do it with a girl. Kigoin, for example, shehim mevatrim zelozeh. It has to be a case where everybody is willing to be mevater. Everybody's willing to give in to the other guy. Vein makpidin, and they're not going to be makpid. They're not going to stand on ceremony. And what's the right word? I'm looking for the right English word for makpid. They can't be. Boy, wow, the word is escaping me. They can't, be standing in place, and be stubborn and say, no, I wanted that portion. So let's say you have 2 people that want to divvy up a brisket, right? So you could only divide up the brisket if you're not going to use a girl, right? You're going to cut the brisket in half. Now, if they're makbid on each other, each guy's going to say, no, I want the bigger half. No, I want the bigger half. I think that side is bigger. I think that side is bigger. Then you're going to want to make a girl. Fine, we'll cast lots. Whoever gets the winning lot, he gets to pick first. You can't do that on Yom Tov. The reason you can't do that on Yom Tov is because we're afraid when you're dealing with people that are makpid on each other, and they're going to have disagreements over who should take which piece, and now you're going to come to things like casting lots. You might also come to midah. You might come to measuring and weighing, which are activities that are forbidden on Yom Tov. Those are usur. You might also come to writing. So if people are going to be standing on ceremony and going to be makbid zelozeh, then you can't do this. So you can only do this if there's no casting lots, there's no anything. Everybody's nice to each other and everybody's willing to be mavater, and you get what you get and you don't be upset. Then you could do this. Nobody's going to be makbid and turn around and say, hey, he got a better portion than me. But But if you're talking about people that are makbid on each other, utzrichin goyrel, and therefore you need a goyrel, aser, then it's aser. Vayin tzayv siman shin chav beis, va'afilu goyrel al yidei sakin. Even if, when you go to the takeout counter, excuse me for 1 second. I hate doing this in the middle of shir, but this is important. Hello? Yeah, quick. I'm in the middle of saying shir. Okay. So, when you go to the takeout counter and you want a piece of potato kugel, what does the guy do? He takes the knife and he puts it down on the kugel. You want a piece like this? You want a piece like that? Says the Chavetz Chaim, even to do that, the butchers would do this. What they would do is not so much that they would show with the knife what size piece do you want, but what they would do is they have two customers over here and they're vying for the better piece. They're vying for the better piece. So you know what? So the butcher takes the knife, he lays it down in the meat, and he says, all right, which side do you want? Do you want the blunt side of the blade or do you want the sharp side of the blade? Which side do you want? So now you get to look and you get to pick. Says the Chavetz Chaim, afilu garla yedei sakin k'moshe oisan hakatzavim. Dahainu shemanichin sakin beishnei hachalakim, where they lay the blade of the knife down between the two portions. V'shayalim lahakainim, and they ask the purchasers, Eizet tzad roitze, which side of the blade do you want? Im achelik shemunach letzad hachad. Do you want the side that's on the sharp side of the blade? Or do you want the side that's on the dull side of the blade? That's also called a gairol, and it's also aser, because still you see that the consumers are makbid on each other. And if they're makbid on each other, you might come to weighing and measuring, which are forbidden on Yom Tov. Ice cut and hay, the Mechaber said, what do? Umevi, you bring two animals, like we explained. Ritzayin Elohim, the Chavetz Chaim says what the Mechaber wants to say is, you're doing this so that you know how much the customers have to pay later. You have one animal where brisket is worth $25, and you have another animal where the brisket is worth $60. Right? You have different animals, different sizes. Therefore, the Chachamim said, before you even check the animal, you have two live animals. Maybe behema acheris, bring another animal, sheshavya kazu le'ein aroya, two animals that look to be the same. Ulamachar shaman dameha, and then tomorrow evaluate the surviving animal. V'chein yishalmu, and according to that, that's how much the consumers will pay, like we explained. Minira, and the Chavetz Chaim says it seems dem akainim saimchim al hatabach bedvar hamekach sheyomer lehem lamachar. If the customers trust the butcher, and the butcher, they tell the butcher, listen, you'll tell us tomorrow how much we owe you. Ain't tzarich lahavi be'macheres. You don't have to do what the Mechaber is telling you here. Like I said, this is not Hilchas Yom Tov, that you have to bring two animals and you have to do the evaluation of the customer's bill in that way. No, if the customers trust the butcher and the butcher will tell them on Isruchag, okay, you owe me $50, you owe me $100, you owe me $20, that's fine. It's just an Eitz Tova. You could go to a Yiddish butcher or a non-Jewish butcher and say to him, "Tenli regular chetzi, give me a leg or a half a leg." As long as you don't mention a price and you don't mention a business deal, you don't say, "Give me a leg, I'll pay you tomorrow." You just say, do me a favor, I need for my holiday, give me a leg of the animal. And he understands that tomorrow you'll come in and pay him. And then tomorrow you'll pay him according to what you took. Okay, the Mechaber said you bring two animals, zu kazoo. You bring two animals that seem to be alike to each other. Even using this method, you still can't speak out clearly and say, you'll say to the butcher, look, the money that you're going to take tomorrow, based on the valuation of this remaining animal, I'm giving it to you tomorrow in return for this meat that you're giving me today. The heavy schum mekach, because that's another way of saying out how much you're paying him. The same way you can't say, give me $100 worth of prime rib, you also can't look at the prime rib and look at the prime rib that's going to remain by the butcher that you're going to use for your evaluation tomorrow. You can't tell the butcher, you see that prime rib? According to the amount that you're going to evaluate this piece of prime rib, that's how much I'm going to pay you for this piece of prime rib that I'm taking now. No, that's also like speaking out of business deal. Ice cotton Zion, afilu b'kahai. Nope, that's the Ramah. Okay, let's go to the Ramah. Hago. V'yeshai, remember the Ramah says there are those that say the dafka Yisrael legaba Yisrael shari kai gavna. This heter only exists by a yid who's buying meat l'simchas yomtiv from a Yiddish butcher. Aval Yisrael ameina Yehudi afilu b'kai gavna aser. But a yid who wants to buy from a non-Jewish butcher, that would be aser, even this type of deal where you're not specifying an amount of money and you're taking the traditional portion sizes and you're using a second animal to evaluate how much you owe him, that would be aser if you're dealing with a non-Jewish butcher, according to some opinions. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Zayin. Afilu b'kaigam na aser. Hainu. Afilu b'loy pisak damim. Even if you don't specify an amount of money, Sha'imar la'akum, you say to the non-Jew, Hareini imcha b'behema zu l'mechza. I'm into you for this meat, for this animal, for half an animal. You're not allowed to do that. Since a yid generally does not become a partner with a non-Jew, everybody realizes that this deal that you're making with the non-Jew is a business transaction. And therefore they were not lenient. There are those who disagreed, and they make no difference between whether the butcher is a Yid or a non-Jew. And therefore, as long as you don't specify a dollar value, it's mutter. Is for Rishina. However, the Chavetz Chaim says that you should be ruled stringently like the earlier opinion. This hakpada that you should be machmer when dealing with a non-Jewish butcher or a non-Jewish store owner, that's only when you're dealing with something like meat where the value is not clear. You need to weigh it. You need to specify a price. But something that has a fixed, very well-known price, like eggs or nuts. Everybody knows a dozen eggs is $1.35. A dozen eggs, so everybody knows the value. Then you could deal with the non-Jew and you could make up, I'm going to take a portion of eggs, I'm going to take a portion of nuts, as long as you don't mention a price. The cost of a lavush to also Yisrael limkar la'akum b'yomtiv afilu b'loy pisik damim. A yid is not allowed to sell to a non-Jew on Yom Tov, even if they don't speak out any prices, and of course no actual transaction takes place, just you give the non-Jew the merchandise that he wants, it'll pay you back after Yom Tov. You cannot do that. Unless there's a question of significant loss to the Jew. Could go in basa treifa, for instance, a yid has basa treifa that he has to sell. The Chachamim will not matter these kinds of deals. Only when a yid is looking to buy food because he needs it for his Yom Tov Suda, that's when we will matter it. But we will not matter to facilitate a non-Jew buying something. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. The schus of Liman HaTorah should stand Gans Klal Yisrael in good stead. The Rabbi should send Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa to everyone. Everyone should have everything wonderful. And B'yirtzeh Hashem, we will continue tomorrow with Sif Beis. Be well.